3. Absolute nonsense. Before I even finished the sentence, Richard slapped his palm on the table and shot to his feet. The speed of his reaction, like he'd been waiting for exactly those words. "Evan, your grandmother traveled all the way here, and this is the welcome you give her? Bringing some outsider in to cause a scene?" Evan's eyes went cool and flat. This young woman has said exactly 3 sentences since she walked in. You and Sandra are reacting awfully hard. Either she hit a nerve or… Stella jumped in quickly. Lance has been critically ill and only just started improving. Anyone would be upset to hear him accused of stealing someone's life. Richard Hartwell has 2 sons, I said to Stella, and I never said which one took Cody's life. Aren't you kind of giving the game away? Stella's face went through several colors. She opened her mouth, glanced at Sandra's lethal glare, and shut it. I reached into my bag and pulled out the paper crane I'd folded that morning, murmured an incantation, and released it. The crane spread its wings and lifted into the air. It flew across the room, then was struck down by an invisible force as it passed Derek Hartwell's wheelchair. I looked at the small ghost perched on Derek's shoulder. The ghost met my eyes, tilted its head, and grinned. That ghost was Lance. Something was wrong with this picture. If Lance was technically still alive, he should be a wandering soul at most, not a full ghost. How could he be a malevolent spirit? This situation was more complicated than a simple life theft. And the reactions from this whole family, something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on what. "Miss, I don't know what trick you used to make that paper crane fly, but I'd appreciate it if you'd stop making a scene." Sandra exhaled, feigning composure now that the crane had fallen. Richard scoffed. "Evan, you swore off your shares in the company yourself. Don't put on a show in front of grandmother and use outsiders to stir the pot." Evan looked entirely unbothered by any of it. He walked to the sofa, poured himself a cup of tea, and settled back like he was watching a play. "So, this young woman is a shaman? She's been entrusted to recover a stolen life. I'm genuinely curious. How does one go about doing that?" With that, every eye in the room landed on me. Especially Derek's. I reached into my bag and brought out the Enyong bronze bell. The inner ring of the bell was carved from the bone of someone who had died full of bitter grief. The outer ring was strung with black dog's teeth as a pendulum. Once the bell was crafted, its surface was wrapped in gold leaf and tempered for 9 days and 9 nights. Then it was hung in a graveyard for 10 days to absorb resentment, and in a church for 10 more days to absorb sanctity. 1 part grievance, 1 part grace, fused beneath a skin of gold. That was the Enyong bell. My dad had once told me this bell could drive off not just malevolent ghosts and revenants, but also practitioners who had turned to dark arts. A low resentment spirit like Lance, barely a ghost, was no match for it. When Lance saw the bell in my hand, his grin disappeared. He stretched out both arms and wrapped them around the throat of the other Hartwell boy in the wheelchair, Derek. Derek's whole body went rigid. His eyes began to fill with blood. "Dad," Derek managed, his hands flying to his own neck. "It hurts, I can't breathe." The Hartwells swarmed around Derek in a panic. Richard rushed to check on him. Stella grabbed her phone to call their private physician. In the chaos, I shook the bell. Ding. The clear, bright ring sent a swarm of invisible hands grasping toward Lance. The hands tore at Lance's form. Lance fought back by squeezing Derek's throat harder, using the connection as an anchor. I chanted and shook the bell, the invisible hands pulling harder, and Derek's condition worsened. His face was turning the color of raw liver. Another second, and he'd suffocate. The Hartwells noticed. Richard stormed toward me, fist raised. What are you doing to him? I sidestepped. Why don't you ask your lovely wife Sandra what she's been doing to him? I added, don't interfere. He won't be seriously hurt. Give it 3 more minutes. He won't just be fine, he'll actually feel better. Richard wasn't listening. He lunged again to grab my bell. Stop this. If anything happens to Derek, 1,000 lives won't cover what you owe. Derek's lucky his dad turned out to be someone like you, I said, dodging and shaking the bell faster. The servants piled in too. Before they pinned me down, Lance let out a sharp, terrible wail and fled. Derek was free. He doubled over, hands clutching his throat, drawing huge, heaving lungfuls of air. 5 minutes later, I was escorted, politely, to the best seat in the living room. Sandra and Stella had slipped away in the confusion. They were probably scrambling to find a way to deal with me. Evan looked at me with something like quiet admiration, the kind you might give a promising younger generation. Did he know this was going to happen? Miss Healer? Richard looked at me with desperate urgency.
He meant Derek.
Everything you said is true? My son. Can he be saved? He explained that Derek had been struck by a sudden illness 3 years ago and had been confined to that wheelchair, plagued by sickness ever since. I studied Derek carefully. Something about him felt cold and shadowy, not like a victim, more like a villain. The feeling was strong. You say your son was suddenly stricken with illness, but I'm not seeing any dark affliction on him. I wanted to say, is he faking, but better to keep that to myself. Richard looked unsettled, flustered. Could it be a more advanced kind? We'll come back to that, I said, pulling my gaze away from Derek. The most urgent thing was getting Cody's life back. Richard nodded and made small talk. If we take back the stolen life, does that mean Lance is done for? I know this was a despicable thing to do, but Lance has been my son for 10 years. Lance hasn't been human for a long time. Whatever life he clung to these past 10 years, he took it from others. Richard pressed his lips together and said nothing more. I called Uncle Ray and told him to bring Cody over and to bring the jade bracelet I'd buried. An hour later, Uncle Ray and Aunt Fran arrived with Cody in their arms. In Lance's bedroom, the 2 boys lay side by side on the same bed. It was only 4 in the afternoon, but the sky outside the mansion had already gone dark with snowfall drifting past the windows. Aunt Fran looked at Derek with a puzzled expression. Strange. I feel like I've seen this child before. 10 years ago. Let's step out and let Miss Jess work. Richard jumped in, ushering everyone toward the door. Derek's eyes flickered with shadow. He lowered his head and quietly rolled his wheelchair out.